What is going on, everyone? Welcome back to the Corey Austin Theorem, where we talk about kratom, 7-hydroxy, any other mind-altering substance that may pop into my little brain. We talk about life. We talk about how to come off of those substances successfully. We talk about how to stay off of those substances successfully. I want to say as a disclaimer right out of the gate, this is not medical advice. I am not a psychotherapist, a psychologist, a psychiatrist, any sort of drug addiction or drug therapist, none of these things, okay? I'm just a guy who has been through it. Just a guy who has been through it. A guy who is willing to be vulnerable and talk about my own perceived weaknesses. Not all of them. I mean, let's be honest. There are certain things about my life that, specifically my past life, that I'm not going to get on the internet and tell the whole world. There are certain things I will absolutely just take to my grave, right? I think everybody has a small bucket of things that may have happened in their past, specifically, that they'll just take to their grave. And I'm one of those. You know, I'm right with God on those things, but as far as divulging certain things to mankind, you know, there's a small handful of things that I'll just never tell anyone. It's just the way it is, right? But we were talking about in my last video, you know, the idea that a lot of the reasons, or much of the reason that many of us who end up abusing substances end up doing that is because of unresolved childhood traumas, teenage traumas, in some cases even adult traumas. And by unresolved, I mean you never talked about them. You never dealt with them. If you needed to grieve those traumas, or there was some sort of trauma that happened to you, whether it be, physical, sexual, mental, emotional abuse, whatever it is, maybe you never talked with someone about that. Maybe you did what 95% of all people who are victimized in that way do, and you shoved it down into the pit of the basement, or the pit of your subconscious, if you will, and you just never talked about it. And then from that moment forward, as you know, those sort of traumas and those sort of negative experiences, although they may not come out in a verbal way where you sit down with an adult, a parent, or a pastor or a therapist and divulge whatever that secret is or whatever happened to you, it has to come out some way, right? And a lot of times later on in life, that hurt and that trauma and the anger, frustration, abandonment, all those negative feelings that a person may feel, they tend to come out in other ways, right? And for me, as a young kid, that came out in ways of, trying new substances, trying too hard to impress people that were older than me specifically. And a lot of times that came in the form of trying new drugs, being the crazy kid who was like, oh yeah, I'll take some, And just a side note on that, this whole, fentanyl crisis, where you have people literally killing over and dying from something deadly like fentanyl, thank God, thank the Lord that that sort of thing was not around and really available, at least readily available that I know of, when I was a young kid. When I was a young kid, when I was in high school, about the best anybody was really doing, at least in my small rural town in North Carolina, was weed and alcohol. And if you were considered a really bad boy, you'd hear about somebody getting into some cocaine or messing around a little bit with cocaine or something like that. But as far as high school and when I was growing up, it was alcohol and weed, man. It was pretty much it. It's pretty much all you ever heard of, right? And I didn't even try marijuana until after I was out of high school. But to go back to it, for me, it not only came in the form of trying to impress other people and also, being too open and too free to try other substances. It expressed itself in an over-sexualized way for me. And I talked about yesterday how I saw my first pornographic magazine before I was 8 years old. Which is absolutely an unhealthy age to see people completely disrobed in a sexualized way, solely for the purposes of voyeurism, solely for the purposes of other people looking at them, right? And I did have a few childhood traumas, not at the result of my family or my parents, but I did have some things happen, specifically sexually, that I absolutely shoved down into the basement and didn't talk about. Now, again, this is one of those things I hate when I start talking about childhood trauma, and then I think about anything that I might have went through. I almost don't feel worthy to talk about those things because I hear all the horror stories and I see all the headlines and the news headlines, and I listen to a lot of like crime story documentary sort of thing, so I know what kind of abuse and neglect and violence and traumatic experiences that children all around the world do experience, all the way up until death, right? And so anything that I went through seems like a molehill compared to the mountain of abuse that I've heard about other children going through. So I don't want to paint this picture like, oh, I was this, horribly abused child. It's nothing like that. Nothing like that. For me, it was, just a few handful. It was just not even a few handfuls. It was just a few isolated instances that you can hold in one hand, right? Less than 5 fingers, that sort of thing. But nonetheless, I was a sensitive kid growing up, very empathetic, sympathetic towards others. That's how I was as a child. And those things that happened to be nonetheless affected me in a negative way. And it set off a sexualized nature in me. It caused me to lose my virginity earlier than I probably would have had I not had those experiences at such a young age, right? And, for me, it also was a little bit worse. And why am I talking about this? Well, because this is something that is relative to addiction. You'll find a lot of people that struggle with addiction or struggle with substance abuse also struggle with these other addictions, or also struggle with these other life experiences and or character flaws that I'm discussing right now, right? So for me, it was kind of a perfect storm, because at that time, when I lost my virginity, everybody, all the kids my age, that's what they were talking about. Most of them hadn't done it, but their hormones were going crazy. Everyone was aware of it. Everyone was talking about it as though they were going to do it or couldn't wait until they could do it, that sort of thing. And so I developed this idea in my mind that it was cool if I did that. That was cool. That's what all the little boys wanted to do. Well, I was going to be the cool one that actually did it, right? And then when I say it was a perfect storm, you also, on the second finger, I was a popular kid. I was a handsome little kid. A lot of the little girls liked me. And I was the new kid at school quite a lot as well. So I got a lot of attention in that way. And I had my sexual nature had been flipped on at a very young age, being exposed to pornography. I talked about us finding my uncle's pornographic magazine collection in my grandmother's attic when we were just young kids, and being like, and at that time, it's one of those things where my parents were like, they found a pornographic magazine collection, and what'd they do? Well, they obviously took it away, hid it back up into, the attic, and it's just one of those things where they were like, oh, it's just what kids do, right? All kids do that. And that's not a lie. A lot of them do, but you can't unsee what you've already seen, right? I had already seen it. So once I got to the age where sexuality began to kind of express itself, you mix that kind of with some of the trauma that I had gone through, seeing the pornographic magazines at an early age, being a popular kid at school, being handsome. And that's kind of what at that time, those things kind of shaped me and cut out my niche for myself. Well, that's how I was going to separate myself from others. That's how I was going to be cool and different, right? I was going to be that ladies' man kid who, always had chicks, all the girls liked me, and, I could pick up chicks right and left. That was my thing. And I developed this, and this followed me all the way through my teenage years and all the way through my adulthood even. And, I got into just about every relationship I had a lot of trouble staying faithful to that person. About every relationship I had, I was also looking at pornography, especially when it became something that was, especially when it was online and you could find it anywhere. All you had to do was just go on the internet, and you could go to a billion different websites where you could watch pornography. At that point, especially, it became something that was just ingrained in part of my life, and I definitely suffered from an addiction to pornography for quite a long time. And so that was just an extension of my addiction, right? Was the pornography, but it bled over into other parts of my life, being able to be faithful to my partners, to my first spouse specifically. Now I've done a lot of work in this regard, and this is one area of my life where I am proud of myself that I've made a lot of positive changes. I don't look at stuff like that anymore. It's one of those things now where I've even talked to my eldest son about it, about how it causes you to objectify women, and it just is toxic to the male brain. It causes you to not be able to really understand intimacy, because you look at intimacy as sex. That's it. When you become addicted to pornography, your version of intimacy is some chick getting railed out by some guy, and she doesn't even have to know him or love him or care or anything else, right? Because that's what you see in these pornographic scenes that you watch, right? So it definitely caused a lot of trouble in my relationships, including in my first marriage. And it's one of those things where that was just an extension of my addiction to substances, right? And that's important, because when you take a step back and you're looking from a third party perspective at your own life, what's important is that you have to identify those things that you may have gone through as a child or as a young person that shaped you into being who you are today. And I got to a point in my life that I think that my spirit and my soul was completely filled with secrets, negativity, and bad experiences, really, that I had cut out for myself, that I had made the choice to cut out for myself, right? And that was something that I got to a point where it was what I like to call a tipping point. I just couldn't do it anymore. I literally could not do it anymore. And I felt like that if I had to lie one more time to a family member or to my wife or anything else, that I would literally just fall over and die on the floor. That's pretty much how I felt. I don't know what it was. I don't know if it was just God stepping in and saying you've had enough, but I had gotten so depressed, so down on myself, so ashamed of the reflection that I saw when I looked in the mirror, that I felt like I could not lie or keep one more secret before I would literally just explode into nothingness, or implode into nothingness. So I thought I would edit this part in. I needed to add a little bit of context and a little bit of detail to my video yesterday, because as I started listening to the video, I'm like, you know what, as far as the whys and the reasons that I actually quit watching porn, not doing porn. I never did porn. Well, maybe on a personal level, but this shit's already going off the rails. All right, so my wife now, when we first got together, I was still watching porn at that time. It was something that was very deeply entrenched part of my life, and it had been. And porn is just another addiction. It's just another dopamine hit. You watch porn, you get a little excited, you may wank the willy, gets you a little dopamine rush from that, but then afterwards you're like, there was absolutely very little effort, hardly any, there's no intimate value whatsoever in what just happened. I don't even know this person. They're not even right in front of me. This literally has been a way for me to avoid being intimate. You know what I mean? And people who struggle with addiction and sexual addictions, one of the reasons that they struggle with those addictions is because they actually have trouble with actual intimacy. And actual intimacy is something that I still struggle with. I'm a lot better than I was, but it's one of those things where when you see your first pornographic magazine at 7, 8 years old, and everything that you know about intimacy is nudity, sex, your dick getting hard, or having an orgasm, whatever the case is, then you tend to struggle when it comes to having an actual intimate, contact with another person. Now, mindless sex, that's one thing, because you don't have to invest anything in that, right? But to be intimate with someone that you are actually invested in, like a spouse or someone that you've been with for a long time, or that you have kids with, and that you've been not only on the mountain peaks but in the valleys with, that's when the intimacy troubles come to light, right? And so my wife, you know how they say there's a person for everyone. Well, that's absolutely true for my wife. She knew I had some issues. She knew I had some demons that I was struggling with when we met. And was she okay with it? I wouldn't say she was okay with it as much as she was able to look past those things because she loved me so unconditionally. She looked at me much like God looks at me. you know, and she was able to be patient with me, understand those were my demons, and see that underneath this worldly, fucked up exterior, with having seen the porn, having some trauma and sexual trauma as a child, you know, through all of this worldly exterior shit, that there was a guy with a good heart up underneath, who loved his family, who loved people, and was worth loving back, you know. And that was the problem. That was the whole problem. I didn't feel lovable. How could I be lovable? You know, these things happened to me when I was young. I'm damaged. I got picked on. Why did they pick on me? What's wrong with me? You know, that sort of thing. I felt broken. You know, I had a low self-esteem. As ironic as it may seem, you know, and a lot of people look at somebody like me, they're like, bro, you seem to have it all. You know, you're fit, you're in good shape, you dress nice, you got a good family. What would you possibly have to be, you know, insecure about? And, you know, their insecurity is a worldwide pandemic. It just is. And many of those people who fall into the category of being insecure from the outside appear to have it all together, and appear to be the exact opposite of that. A very secure, a very confident person, right? And you can't see through the pictures that people post on Facebook and Instagram and be able to tell whether that person's struggling in their life, right? So it got to a point as well where I developed a deeper sort of love for my spouse. That being that in the past, when I showed my ass the way I did with her, especially in the beginning, you know, women didn't know how to deal with that. And the more I pushed them away because my lack of ability to really be intimate, and when I say intimate, I'm not talking about sex. Sex wasn't a problem. Sex was, that's all I was about, was sex. I'm talking about the other stuff, right, that you would consider intimacy. And she was able to, whereas other women eventually got tired of that and just, I just can't do this anymore. And then there was eventually a boiling point, and myself or them broke off the relationship, and we both moved on, right? And my wife, anytime I showed my ass, her whole thing was, how can I love you better? How can I love you better? It got to a point where her unconditional love for me taught me so much. You know, it taught me that despite the rough exterior, despite my checkered past, despite all of the things that I had done and been involved in that I felt shame or guilt about, that I was lovable. You know, she saw me through the eyes of God, you know, and that taught me that I must be lovable. Because if I was not, this chick would have bounced way back when, right? But she saw something more in me. She saw the potential in me. She saw what I had the ability to be, right? And of course, you know, we were a match made in heaven. We're both musicians. We both sing. You know, we're both hard workers. We have a lot of the same values, share a lot of the same interests, those sort of things. But my wife and her unconditional love for me, and showing me what unconditional love really was, and being an example of that, really changed me in a lot of ways. And I got to the point where I looked in the mirror and was like, I can not only do this to myself anymore because I'm killing my own spirit, my own soul, but I can't do this to this beautiful woman anymore. this woman who has loved me unconditionally, relentlessly, and I can't do this to God anymore. The one who sent me this amazing woman, despite the fact that I've lived a lot of my life just being an asshole. You know, and I'm not saying I am an asshole, but I've spent a lot of my life acting out in ways that were not directly in tune with who I was as a person, if that makes sense. You know, doing what I had to do to survive based on what I experienced as a child, that sort of thing, right? But, you know, all the promiscuity, you know, treating women like they were, you know, some object that I could just indulge myself with however I felt the need, sexually or otherwise, and then just dumping them to the side like yesterday's trash when I was done with them. I mean, I did some of that. I did a fair amount of that, and it was, and it's not me. It's the broken version of me. But that's why I got to that tipping point where I looked in the mirror and I didn't even recognize myself. And I also had a few talks with God. And I realized through that process that God saw me for how He made me and how He knows I am in terms of the light in my heart, right? He knows I love people. He knows I care about people. He knows I don't want to see anyone suffer. I was that way as a kid before I became damaged. And then hurt people, right? Now, marinate on that for a second. Hurt people. And I was no different. And listen, that's not an excuse. There were millions of times throughout my life that I could have stopped, gotten help, made a different decision, started making better choices, that sort of thing. But, you know, everybody, some people it takes longer than others. Some people never get there. But either way, everyone has a different path to get there. And that was me. I had a longer, windier, curvier path to get there. But I'm there, and it's been the love of God that has shown me that I am worth loving. And it's been a spouse that has loved me unconditionally and shown me that I'm worth loving. And it's been both of my kids being in my life. You know, my 19-year-old now, who still lives with me, lived with his mom, who's my first wife, for, you know, primarily for the first 13, 14 years of his life. And a lot of you know, some of you don't. He traveled the world. He and his mom and his stepdad at that time, I mean, they lived in Barcelona, Spain for 5 years. My eldest son is bilingual. He's been to Asia. He's been to Brazil. He's been to all parts of Europe, Germany, Italy. But he came back to live with me when he was 14 years old because when COVID hit, and he was living in Florida at that time. They had moved back to the States, and he came to live with me. He needed his father. And when that happened, and then 3 years later, my wife and I found out that she was pregnant with my now 2-year-old son, River. You know, all of those things being put back in my life, and the fact that after all the bullshit that I had done in my life, God had given me the unconditional love of a beautiful wife, a beautiful home off of a golf course with a lake behind the house, with a hot tub on the lower deck, both of my children, even the one from my first, now broken marriage, living with me. So I have both of my children with my whole families together. I just got to this tipping point of, I can't live like this anymore. I cannot tell one more lie to my family. I'm going to become a dependable man, a dependable adult, and I am going to do the next right thing and do whatever I have to do in this life to just be a better father and a better husband. And that's it. And I wanted to interject that right there. That's why I stopped watching porn. I could not hurt my wife in that way one more time. There has to be a hard stop. I can't do this anymore. Can't keep living this way, right? And I made that decision at that point. And that's been quite a few years ago now. But and I've not been perfect, of course, but I can tell you so much of my life has changed since I made that decision. And I've just made a very conscious effort to start making better, more positive choices for myself, and oftentimes doing the hard things that I know doing the hard things today that I know that they're going to benefit me later, right? Because doing the easy thing today, taking the easy road today, doesn't always mean that's going to be the best thing for your future. In fact, many times it's the opposite. You do the harder things today to cut out a better, more positive future for yourself, right? So anyway, I just want to drop a little knowledge on you guys about that. And yeah, I'm going to go. The next video I will drop, it will be in the mountains on vacation. I cannot wait. A little over 24 hours, and our car will be loaded up. We'll be headed off to the western North Carolina mountains. I will take a video there and let you guys know where I'm at and all that good stuff. But anyway, thanks for listening to the channel. If you would, please continue to support it. Like the video, comment on the video, subscribe to the channel, of course. There's a little thanks button down there that looks like this. If you feel like dropping your boy a couple of bones for the time that he spends on it, if you get something out of it. Anyway, I gotta go. Love you guys very much. Thanks for listening. I will see you on the next one. Peace.